Professional wrestling, one of the world's favorite pastimes. Now, normally dominated by the World Wrestling Entertainment, we finally, thanks to the internet, are able to view a lot more product as far as professional wrestling is concerned. And now with the new All Elite Wrestling, it's prime time that WWE finally got some competition. But the one question on everybody's mind is, who's going to make their toys? And what is up, everybody? Now, even though we're going to be going over the evolution of wrestling toys, I'm well aware of the fact that Netflix and the Toys That Made Us already did an episode. However, they only focused on toys made by the competitors that were eventually bought out by WWE. They left out a lot of different wrestling companies as well as other toy companies. That's what we're going to cover today in this particular video. So right now we're going to be kicking this review off with the original LJ Ed Wrestling Superstars. Here I have Hulk Hogan. Now obviously this has absolutely no articulation, and if you saw in that episode of The Toys That Made Us, they wanted to focus more on the dynamic poses. And with the gummy surfaces of how this was done, it's still made for a very, very playable toy. However, as far as collectability, it was kind of there. The truth about those particular toys were, yes, they were big, and yes, they were all muscular, but you couldn't really get that much out of them. Cool to finally have, because the whole reason why people buy these action figures and other collectibles is because that's the closest you're gonna have to your heroes coming to life. Sadly, this was all we could get, so that's why we put up with it. Around the same time that that was happening, the AWA came out with their line of figures as well. Now no, these are not Masters of the Universe knockoffs. This was actually off of Remco's original Warlord toy line. The problem with these is that yes, these are the wrestlers of the AWA, but why do their boots look like they belong on the Warlord? I mean, with those barbarian-esque cuffs? Obviously this isn't what they were made for. And that championship belt? I'm sorry, does that look like the AWA championship belt? Of course not. That's actually what the NWA heavyweight title looked like. But of course they weren't going to be able to get their hands on that. Now if these toys were out at the same time and they were done by two completely different wrestling companies, mind you, when I lived in New York, I wasn't able to see any AWA matches. However, if he was the ace of the WWF, and he was the ace of the AWA, naturally you'd want the two of them to try to fight each other. Classic champion versus champion. Do these toys even look like you can have the dream match you've always wanted? Seriously, not gonna happen. So after LJN had lost the license for WWF, Hasbro stepped up and gave us these. The WWF action figures with all the different action features that they had. Each one always came with a spring-loaded action feature. And with these cool blocky cartoony looks that they came with, it was larger than life at the time. As great as those toys were, what came next was a little bit, I wouldn't call it so much a letdown as much as a underwhelming surprise. Because next we had Galoob's WCW toy line. Now, again, just like with the AWA, I never saw WCW in New York. Except for the 1 year that I lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the only person I've ever heard of was Sting and Cactus Jack. It wasn't until the Galoob toy commercial that I finally knew who Lex Luger and the Steiner brothers were. The next time I saw them, they popped up at WWF. But these particular toys, not only do they hold the same dynamic poses like the WWF LJN toys, but these are half the size. And not to mention, with a complete lack of action features, again, you're not gonna get the dream matches that you wanted with your WWF toys. Not to mention the fact the awful decal work with the WCW belt. I mean, yeah, it's a big gold belt, but at that time, they weren't using the big gold as the WCW title. That was still the NWA World Heavyweight title. And at this point, the only belt they were using was this one. No United States Championship, no Television Championship, and no Tag Team Championship. And if they happened to package two Tag Team Champions together, it was all this ugly belt. Shortly after, Galoob lost the rights to WCW. In fact, they got rid of most of the top executives that even improved the WCW toy line. But Hasbro had also let go of the WWF toy line, mostly because this was coming more towards the Attitude Era. So the next toy company to step up was this little indie company called Jakks Pacific. And this is what we got. Now, these toys had a certain playability about them, but obviously they looked absolutely nothing like the superstars they're supposed to be. This Ken Shamrock is completely unrecognizable if not for the fact that his trunks say Shamrock. And, well, Dan Severn vaguely looks like him, but more looks like Freddie Mercury. Now, if you think the WWF toys were bad, I got news for you. It gets a little bit worse, because WCW was still in the game, and this was the best that they can offer. Now, the original executives of Galoob were eventually let go and started their own toy company, the original San Francisco Toy Makers. And because of the relationship that they had with WCW, they got the okay to move these stinkers across. And guess what? They used that same ugly belt that Galoob had for their WCW title. And once again, because you have two completely different styles of action figures, it was almost impossible to have a realistic dream match between the two promotions. Things slightly began to improve, but at the same time, didn't get much better. As the Monday Night Wars started to begin, WCW started to catch an early lead, but they also caught an early lead within the Toy Wars, because Toy Biz, offering them a lot more money than original San Francisco Toy Makers, came out with these. Now, the face sculpts a lot of time was hit or miss as far as the particular wrestler, but the spring-loaded action figures that they had, by squeezing their legs or whatever, actually made these a lot more playable and slightly more collectible, considering the fact that there was no such thing as collector-friendly packaging. One of the biggest grievances that I have with this particular toy line is the fact that this WCW belt, the only way you could get it was by having gotten this figure in the first series. No other figure came with it, not to mention they didn't make any of the other championship belts. And what really sucks, this is the first Rey Mysterio Jr. figure. He does absolutely nothing. He was packed as an accessory for the sole purpose of getting jackhammered by Goldberg. Jakks Pacific came out with a completely new redesign for their WWF toys. Not too bad, but at the same time, the only reason I know this is Ken Shamrock, because Ken Shamrock is written on his shirt. The only reason I know this ugly piece of junk is Triple H is because of the 3 H's written on his crotch and his butt. One of the main things that drew a lot of people to this particular toy line was the 2 electronic prongs on their feet. This was part of their Titantron series, where they had a Titantron with the 2 electronic strips that every time one of the toys would step their foot on it, that particular wrestler's theme song would start. As cool a feature as that was, they still could have done a lot more. Their next version of WWF toy lines, obviously a lot more cooler. However, due to all the extra articulation that was added, they came out a little bit slimmer, but it was still a cool feature to have. Introducing the WWF finishers. Now, these still had the microchip on the bottom of their foot, so they could still be used for the Titantron feature. something that they were slowly but surely going to be phasing out at this point. But with 19 ports of articulation, particularly where the articulation was, you were finally able to put some of your favorite stars in their favorite moves. Now, remember how I said original San Francisco toy makers lost the license for WCW? Well, they decided to pick up ECW instead, considering that was the only major wrestling company at the time that didn't have its own toy line. So with these, it was interesting for the most part to finally have some action figures of some wrestlers who have never gotten an action figure ever again, especially since most of them never got the chance to shine with WWE. Now, as cartoon and blocky as these were, it kind of reminds you of the Hasbro WWF line, but these have a lot more articulation, and even with that silly little lever action, it helped for the most part. But once again, stylistically, these look nothing like the WCW toys, and definitely look nothing like the WWE toys. So once again, despite the fact that, yeah, you could throw them all in the ring, but it's not a realistic matchup. And that's what's been sorely lacking since the beginning. Now, with the eventual buyouts of ECW and WCW, and then WWF changing its name into WWE, Jakks Pacific decided to also reinvent itself by not only doing more realistic scans, just trying to make more realistic looking figures. And they made it a bit too realistic and too unbelievable. These wrestlers didn't have the same articulation as the finishers, which, like I said, was hoping they would continue to progress upon. But those finger joints, I'm sorry, does that look like a natural fist? Of course it doesn't. But for some reason, Jakks Pacific thought this looked perfect. I guess because since they were going up against a lot of the Marvel Legends at the time, they figured this would be a nice way to compete. But you didn't have the same amount of articulation as a Marvel Legend, so why would you even go there? Yes, Stone Cold kind of looks like Stone Cold, but he also looks like he has scoliosis. I mean, what is with the way his back is bent? Scott Hall barely looks like Scott Hall, and I don't know what the hell that thing is that's sticking out of his mouth. Rob Van Dam? Well, where are his hand wraps? He's always been shown with black hand wraps, and here they have his hands completely bare. Not to mention his trademark ponytail, nowhere to be seen. Shortly after that awful era of the Jakks Pacific toy line, eventually they started putting these out. These were more the Ruthless Aggression. This is when the Ruthless Aggression era started, and these actually aren't too bad. Not only do they have realistic 3D sculpts, but particularly the way the wrist swivels, the way the hand bends back and forth, made it a lot easier to deal with as opposed to that awful finger articulation. However, they still left a lot to be desired. Now, while all this was going on with WWE and the fact that, well, there didn't seem to be any other competition until this little company decided to align itself with the NWA in order to form an internet promotion that soon would be taking the world by storm in the form of Total Nonstop Action Wrestling. Now, the TNA toys were sort of reminiscent of the old Marvel toys, considering they were made by the exact same company. The difference being, just like with WCW, they had some that had spring-loaded features and others that didn't. But this time around, they actually made all the NWA championships, whether Sweet Charlotte herself, and I tell you, she's never looked so good. Not to mention the NWA TNA X Division Championship and the NWA Tag Team Championship. Here was the ultimate downfall of it. None of the figures seemed to be put to scale. I mean, here you have Abyss, who's supposed to be close to 7 feet tall, standing next to Samoa Joe, who's only about 6'2", but for some reason, why is Samoa Joe bigger than Abyss? Not to mention the fact that later on through the series, they decided to make all the wrestlers like Marvel Legends. Now here you got Sanjay Dutt as well as Jay Lethal, and I'm sorry, the face sculpts are hit or miss. I mean, why does Samoa Joe look like John Belushi? But at the same time, this is not what they were supposed to look like. Like, yes, it's cool to have the articulation and everything like that, but it wasn't very helpful. And at this point, Marvel Toys had gone under due to the fact that Marvel decided to do away with it. So once again, WWE had a toy line being completely unopposed, but that didn't stop them from kicking them while they were down. Basically, to compete with a dying toy line, Jakks Pacific came out with Deluxe Aggression. Deluxe Aggression had slightly more articulation, I believe about 21 points of articulation this time around, than the finishers. Now, no, you didn't get the cool Titantron feature, but once again, you had that 3D sculpt and more dynamic posability with each individual superstar. What happened, unfortunately? Well, this is when Jakks Pacific eventually lost the license to WWE. But that didn't stop WWE from making their next toy line. Now that Mattel has the license for the WWE toys, let's be honest, the toys have never looked better. However, the new Elites, clearly biting off of, the Elite. These Elite figures, with just about as much articulation as the Deluxe Aggressions, as great as they are, well, they don't have the same playability. When it came to collectability and playability, the Deluxe Aggressions were where it was at. There's only one other toy line I could say that about, and it wasn't even a wrestling toy line. These, I don't even try to play with, and I definitely don't let kids play with them. I put them on my shelf and I just leave them there, thanks to the collector-friendly boxes that they come packaged in nowadays. But especially these new championship belts that they got, these are now on par with the Marvel Toy Biz TNA championship belts. Just like with the Marvel TNA action figures, they actually put a lot more detail into the championship belts this time around, unlike with Jakks Pacific. But unlike with the Marvel toys, they actually made more championship belts depending on which character you were getting. More than one wrestler has been champion, so more than one wrestler got to be champion. So now with all these different championship belts and the fact that the NWA belt kind of looks like it's done in the same style as the WWE belts, you finally get to pose AJ Styles next to Sweet Charlotte at the WWE title. Now, even though the original San Francisco toy makers did make the next WCW toy line, I've gotten a little bit ahead of myself. I'm not 100% sure when it was that this happened, but they did manage to get the license and make the toys for a wrestling company south of the border this time. This time, Consejo Mundial de Lucha Libre. In other words, CMLL. Now, for some of these wrestlers, these are the first action figures that they were ever going to get. And these toys kind of look like the LWCW toys. Now, I would have had some of these myself if not for the fact that they're impossible to find online, and even if you do manage to find them, they are ridiculously expensive. I'm talking 3 digits before the decimal expensive. Now that I went south of the border, now it's time to take you overseas with, well, there wasn't exactly a name for them, or at least one of them. Because here we have the Hyper Heroes superstar of Antonio Inoki and character product Masakatsu Funaki. Now, even though this is actually from Pancrase, it was still considered a wrestling organization, even though it was actually the first professional mixed martial arts organization. At character product and what seems to be superstar here, well, they made the exact same toy line, despite the fact that these were 2 different eras and 2 completely different toy companies. Now that we've taken a trip overseas, let's take it back home. Because TNA decided, you know what? it's time for us to bring back a new toy line. And in order to do so, Jakks Pacific took a page out of Marvel Toys book with... Now I know what you're thinking. Isn't that just another Jakks Pacific Deluxe Aggression? Actually, that couldn't be any further from the truth, because Jakks Pacific decided to pick up the license for TNA, and the timing could not have been better. Because with the Deluxe Aggression still fresh in everybody's collections, not to mention retailers still having them on the shelves, collectors and wrestling fans finally got to put together the dream matches they've always wanted to see. Like Ace versus Ace, submission versus submission, franchise versus franchise, or Rob Van Dam versus Rob Van Dam, I guess. But the point is, not since Hasbro originally did the G.I. Joe Street Fighters and the Mortal Kombat lines, never have two opposing promotions had the exact same style of action figure as the other. What went wrong? Well, around this time is when TNA was taken over by Hulk Hogan. And well, once everybody stopped caring about TNA, everybody stopped caring about the toys. So this one was unfortunately cast to the wayside. Now, during the time that TNA was having a little bit of success in the toy aisles, another toy company decided to step up with this brand new promotion, introducing Lucha Libre USA Masked Warriors. Now, I know what you're thinking. A majority of these, well, they look pretty similar to the Deluxe Aggression, and that was part of the charm of it. They had the exact same style of articulation, and they stood at the exact same scale. However, these look more like toys, as opposed to Jakks Pacific's line, not to mention Mattel's line, actually trying to look more lifelike. These weren't necessarily bad, but what was wrong with it? Well, two things. One, these were made by Playmates, and unless Playmates is making the Ninja Turtles, nobody really cares about what Playmates is doing. And the second thing, Lucha Libre USA sucked! The true injustice of what happened with Lucha Libre USA Playmates is actually the fact that, as horrible as Lucha Libre USA was, Playmates still had another opportunity if they'd have just held on a little bit longer and used that same style of toy making for Lucha Underground. That way, we finally get the action figures of luchadors like King Cuerno, Son of Havoc, Dragon Azteca Jr., Prince Puma. You know, the wrestlers that don't exist outside of Lucha Underground. Plus, it would have been nice to get those championship belts because, well, that's something I'm going to get into a little bit later. Later on, of course, WWE decided to license these cool figures to SH Figuarts by Bandai. Now, here's The Rock. Now, obviously, he's got so much more posability, different facial expressions, even a bike to talk into. I'm not even trying to open this box up. I mean, yeah, the purpose of it is to eventually put it on a shelf, leave it there in whatever pose, and maybe you can change the pose later. But I'm genuinely afraid of trying to bend any form of articulation on these toys. They're so delicate, it's not funny. As cool as they look, like I said, it's got plenty of collectability and absolutely zero playability. And playability is very important to a collector because that way at least you know that the toy is actually durable. This, like I said, stayed in this box forever. But once again, I've gotten a little bit too far ahead of myself. Because right now, we have to go all the way back to as far as close to like 2007. Let me introduce you to Legends of Professional Wrestling. These were made by the Figures Toy Company. Yeah, not a lot of imagination in that name. Now, cool thing about these is it's nice to have little collectibles of some of these classic wrestling stars. Here's the problem. They don't look very good. They're done more in the style of the first generation of Jakks Pacific WWF figures. And, well, this doesn't actually look like Ricky Steamboat, but it's a little bit passable. Meanwhile, Tito Santana here looks like something out of King of the Hill. Not to mention the fact that their heads only have one pose. Like seriously, this is all they can do. All you could do with these was, hell, I don't know, nothing. Now, due to the internet becoming a lot more prominent, so many more independent wrestling companies are starting to show themselves. And you have legitimate world titles with promotions like Chikara or even Combat Zone Wrestling. Even Major League Wrestling now is making a name for itself. But the more prominent independent wrestling competition was Ring of Honor. And Ring of Honor, when they decided to do their toy line, they went to Figures Toy Company. And this is kind of what we got. You see, Figures Toy Company decided, well, rather than bring us back, King of the Hill, Tito Santana, however, they went for the inferior Ruthless Aggression era toy line. I mean, come on. You had a much better articulated sculpt, but this is what you decided to go with, not to mention the fact that since you didn't have the money for a 3D mold, none of these wrestlers look like the wrestler they're supposed to portray after. And it's sad because a lot of these guys, these were the first action figures they ever got. Now, this isn't Jay Lethal's first action figure, but that looks nothing like Jay Lethal. And the price point? Well, the one thing I give these people any credit for is the clothing. The clothing is actually hand-stitched materials. But these came at a $35 price point. So let me get this straight. You make an inferior product and charge us more than a clearly superior product? What the hell sense does that make? Now, I already started this video off talking about who was going to make AEW's toys. Well, Toy Fair this year revealed that it was going to be Jazzwares finally making a different type of wrestling toy for a completely different company. Now, from what it looks like, these toys look very similar to the WWE Elites. However, I'm not 100% sure if these are going to be in the exact same scale, because all we really want is to be able to stand these figures in the ring with the WWE Elites, so we finally get the dream matches like the Usos versus the Young Bucks, or that dream match everybody's been wanting since New Japan, Shinsuke Nakamura versus Kenny Omega. And plus, it'd be nice to be able to pose Kenny Omega, with his third world title that he's currently holding right now. But that would require that New Japan finally came out with its own toy line, which I'm shocked hasn't happened considering Bandai is a Japanese company and they went with WWE before New Japan. And I would have loved an SD Figuarts of Kazuchika Okada. However, that honor was bestowed upon Super 7. The Super 7 toy line, from what it looks like, well, you have to pre-order these. They're about 45 bucks a pop. Now, they look absolutely amazing, but once again, just like with the SD Figuarts, I'm not taking these guys out of the boxes, which is insane, because just like I said with the Jazzware toys, I would like to pose Kenny holding the IWGP World Heavyweight Championship. Doesn't look like that's going to happen, at least. And of course, the first wave didn't include the ungovernable one himself, but now they're coming out with a whole new wave, again, you have to pre-order, of Los Ingobernables de Japón. Now, aside from that, they also seem to have Lucha Libre figures coming out by Boss Fight Studios. Now, Boss Fight, I'm not 100% sure how much these cost, but the only two figures they seem to be releasing right now is of Pentagon Jr. and Rey Fenix. I wish they would continue the line because I would love to see Drago and Aerostar, just so that I could once again have the Lucha Super Friends. And if they'd have ever made a toy line for Lucha Underground, it would have been great to see the Lucha Super Friends holding the Trios Tag Team title. This year, there has never been a greater time to be a professional wrestling fan. Actually, these last few years, it's never been a greater time to be a fan. And now with all these different toys coming out, with all the different collectability, the posability, all the different superstars being able to finally come together in your collection, I honestly can't think of a better thing to talk about right now. That being said, I'm done talking. You guys have a good night.